Thank you for tuning in to the Court of Public Opinion. You be the judge. The case we're talking about today is the incident or situations that involve device fraud. There's a long explanation of what exactly device fraud is. If you look over here, I leave an actual description of device fraud. This case involves a certain Clinton supporter. This is the transactions. Welcome to the Court of Public Opinion. I don't want to argue with anybody because, you can't make light of something that's petty, but this is what's going to happen. You're going to have people in situations with petty crimes like this. And as long as you have a debit credit card, anyone can be a victim of device fraud, or it maybe fall in the same category as identity theft. And I put it out there for you to really study it yourself. But these cases are, I don't want to make it too personal because obviously, everybody has their personal circumstances and you want to try to separate yourself from this. But if you have a debit card, which I think on average everybody has a debit card, and you were to do an online transaction, in this case, donate to someone, organization, and you have overcharges, which in $20 here and there adds up to a lot. A lot of people end up with overdraft fees in this situation, and they can't crawl out of it. You can't dig out of a hole unless somebody helps you dig out of it yourself. And luckily, you have people around you that can help you dig out of this hole, so thankfully for that, if there's somebody out there that can help you if this happens to you. This certain matters if you do go use the bank card and then you notice these transactions, you pull out the bank statement, or you go to the teller and you do an account activity report, you'll notice that those little charges add up to a lot. So petty crime is a petty crime. Petty crime is probably just as destructive as any larger crime. The thing is that petty crimes are harder to prosecute. They don't charge a lot of times. I mean, you'd have to employ probably another 300, 400,000 police officers and detectives just to argue each of these cases. So that's why it kind of has this cutoff point. But I know, having personally going through something like this, it has to be over $100 in order for it to be considered a fraud. Otherwise, if a first-time offender in this situation, or offenders, if it's an amount over $100, in some states I think it's maybe $150, it has a certain number. I'm not quite sure what all states, 50 states, but I know in Pennsylvania here, if it's over $100 transaction, it's considered device fraud, so they can charge that. But let's just change the topic to petty crimes, because I think that'd be a better discussion than really getting into the ins and outs of this certain matter, because that's obviously something that has to go to court, and that's what was put out in the public. And I don't want to argue with people about something that hasn't even been prosecuted. And unfortunately, in that situation, that's something that's between the bank and the activity person making the claim. Obviously, there's a lot of that happening though, so we don't want to ignore that either. And I know people who want to trust the right people, they want to trust them to use their bank card appropriately, and to think that something like that would be compared to a transaction like an online pornography site, that should say something to you. Consider the source. So, I think the frustration that many of us are feeling is that these little small matters don't get resolved, and then it turns into a big thing and it blows up. So it really helps us to leverage our, I would be very careful to spin this topic, because I think it can upset anybody. And unfortunately, you don't want to take it out on the wrong people, because most people are unsuspecting. They don't find out until they do an activity report, in this case, regarding your bank account statement. And so I don't want to put this topic, I want to put it back in perspective, because I think a lot of times, until you actually personally go through something like that, you couldn't possibly appreciate what that is. And most of us have made foolish purchases of our own, but this is something totally different. This isn't somebody who is going to, they're not making frivolous expense charges. And let me say this, because I think this goes to another topic, and then we're going to talk about why the difficulty that some people are presented with in their marriages, or in this situation where if you have a spouse that's maybe using the bank card, and say it turns into a fight, but if you don't have you got to get your thoughts in order before you ever argue or debate something like this, because I think it's a poisonous debate. It really is. That's why I'm trying to downplay it and kind of water it down myself personally, because I think that a lot of times what happens in marriages, especially with debit card use, is that one person's using the debit card, and if you're not communicating what your purchases are, or you have like a budget, and if you're off budget, it could throw your budget off. And a lot of times this happens in marriages too, where somebody will make a purchase and they're afraid to talk to their spouse, and that should be something that has to be addressed, because you can't run a home on a no budget at all. I mean, if you're going to run a home, you want to run it responsibly, And I think that's one of the things that if you're in a relationship, or you're sharing expenses, and sometimes even people who are cohabitating, and maybe they have a roommate, you want to have the shared expenses, which both of you share the expenses, and then individual expenses. And I think any wise person would want to make sure that you do a responsible budget where you set aside what it needs to be paid for. And I would look at those as the staples, the primary bills, the secondary bills, and then miscellaneous and expenses. The reason I switched this discussion to budget, because I think it's probably a little bit better. We're gonna produce more results when we think in terms of a solution. You can obviously tackle a problem. You can obviously see if you're using a budget. You can always see when there's unauthorized expenses that will show up. And I've noticed this just if you keep a standard budget. Now, that's not always the case. And in some cases, people who work daily, who get, in tipping industry, they typically have to use their balance sheet. And, this is just a personal matter. That's something I don't want to get too far into. But, it's the same thing. You want to budget money wisely, And then when I was over at the gas tank the other day, I noticed the gas is going down a little bit. Look how much many of us have had to pay into gas. And you think about, where could you downsize your budget? Like, how do I afford to stay in where I'm living? Or do I have to change my living situation in order to live under my means? And so there's a lot that comes in with budgeting first. This is how you can notice that. Obviously, somebody who's consistent with a budget, they're obviously going to notice these things, these smaller transactions, but how can you ignore when something like that happens to you? Because I think, again, it falls just along, right enough under the radar that it can't be prosecuted, but and a lot of people who have lent out their bank card to somebody, you run into all kinds of situations. So this is why the banks always say, don't be giving your bank card to anybody. Don't allow anybody to use it. Too many nice people get in trouble, and unfortunately, as long as you trust the right people, that's between you and that person. But otherwise, it's never wise to be, giving your bank card to anybody. And the idea that anybody would be giving their bank card, it's just not the first thing you're thinking about when you're, It's not something people do. It's just the way it is. I mean, any reasonable, responsible person is not going to be giving their bank card to anybody. I mean, most of us are living on such a tight budget as it is. And if you're trying to do the responsible, right thing, that's truly what happens to certain people, is that they run into a problem, and then that's it. It could throw off everything, It doesn't take much to get off track either. That's trying to keep your things under control. It's not easy, especially if you are on a tight budget. And in this case, it's just unfortunate. Thank you for listening.